Hello, welcome to another Glasshouse open call. Today we're going to be talking on the subject of ransomware, people, power, and policy. We've got Dave Eitel, Silas Cutler, myself, Grug, Nina Koller, Jenny June, Jan Lemnitzer, and Jeremy Blackthorn. So that's basically a bunch of cyber strategists, PhDs, professors, and other sundry experts. Before we start, as always, the views expressed are the views of the individuals. They do not reflect the individual policy or position of the individual's employers, any government, or any other entity. Depending on the moment of the debate, any given position may not even be strongly held by the participants, but rather may represent a thought experiment, devil's advocacy argument, or even sarcasm, which never happens, I can assure you. Context matters in understanding statements in complicated and fast-moving conversations. So you're joining us in an ongoing conversation. We've known each other for years. We have lively and animated discussions. We're giving you basically a unique view into the talks and discussions that happens within our circles as we navigate these complex current threats, policy developments, technical issues, etc. Obviously, we don't have scripts. This is live, uncensored, full contact, no holds barred, and cage match. But it also means that we sometimes misspeak, or we have to correct ourselves, or not that it's happened to me, but people can be wrong. So, you know, we let that go. This is friends. We ask that you treat that in the same way. So that said, what are we going to be talking about? Well, as I said, we want to do ransomware, and rather than talking about like the technical details of ransomware or who should or shouldn't be doing ransomware stuff, we want to be talking about, you know, why states might want ransomware, or what levers are available to coerce ransomware, or how ransomware can be used to coerce states. And so, yeah, like, I guess we can start there, and I'll throw it open. So who wants to go first? Okay. Dave, do you have opinions on ransomware?
Unlike other exciting cybersecurity professionals, I've never written ransomware. And I've also never done a big analysis of removing ransomware, right? I don't reverse engineer ransomware for a living like many other people. I definitely would love when ransomware becomes more strategic. I think right now people use ransomware as cover. Like, I think it's good to enumerate how ransomware becomes strategic, right? Like, so ransomware can be used as cover, which we've seen in the past, and ransomware can also be used directly as a methodology, which is something I don't think we've seen yet, right? So if ransomware goes on your $1.4 billion ASML silicon lithography machine, then it is worth $1.1 billion to you, which is a strategic investment. And then I think ransomware also raises funds, right? So I don't know what the other versions of strategic ransomware are. Like, North Korea finds it strategic. It's a part of it.
So I think there's like first and second order effects that you get from ransomware. So obviously the first order effect is, you know, like stuff goes down and people get money. That's sort of the basics. But the second order effects, I think, are also very interesting in that, like, you know, it drives up the price of Bitcoin, which is useful for certain people. It delegitimizes the state because it puts individuals in a situation where, even though they're paying their taxes to be protected from outside threats, they're not being protected. They're being left to their own devices and basically completely exposed. It also, you know, as we said, it provides cover, but I think it also provides, you know, it provides cover for access operations, because now a lot of ransomware includes like exfiltration. And I strongly suspect that if that isn't being sold, it is being at least searched and collected. And, I think, ransomware is a useful bed of innovation for developing a pool of people that you want to hire in the future. And it gives you leverage to hire them very cheaply, because you don't need to pay them a lot of money, because you kick in their door and say, congratulations, you can work for minimum wage or you can go to the gulag. Which way do you want to go? And like, there are cyber police forces that literally take that approach. That is above and beyond just the criminal aspect. And I think that impacts the discussion, because people tend to think of like, how can we stop the criminals, and don't look at the like, well, the states are the only people that have power in this position. They have power over, the people living there, and it's not in their best interest to stop the ransomware.
So I'll jump in. So I think, as was announced earlier, I'll just say again, right? So nothing that I say here represents anything that has to do with my employer or the place that I work. This is purely and literally just off the top of my head as I start to think through this question. So there's the tactical employment of ransomware is really interesting, because it's all about timing. So if you want to get paid, right? If you want to get paid, it's all about timing, and so the highest likelihood that the victim will pay out. And so you want to think about how to employ that. And so as I wander through this question and think about ransomware in a wartime context. So there's high-end, right? There's high-intensity conflict where there are missiles and bombs and ships and things flying. But people often forget that warfighting itself is a long process. There are, with very few exceptions, are there short wars. And so it strikes me as being the case that if you wanted to leverage ransomware strategically, be you a nation state or not, you would wait until you reached the post-Big Bang first set of charges going. And then as you start to have to extract money and resources, either from your own population or other populations, that's when I would anticipate this being an interesting tool. Because again, wars tend to be long, years, if not in the US case, at least a decade. And so I don't know if anyone's having thought, we think about war full time, right? So,
I don't know. I think I disagree with you.
Okay.
And I think the reason for that is the way the United States fights wars, and in particular, the way the Marines have to fight wars. And what that means is we need to get people onto a far away place via either airplanes or boats, or as you would call it, a ship, I assume. And a lot of times those people are going up against opposition that's already in country and in place. And it's a lot easier if they don't realize they're going to be infiltrated when we get there, is I assume a core element of our strategy. And ransomware lets you do that. I would like to disable their onboard defenses or their naval defenses, which are running Windows 95, without them realizing it's a cyber attack from a nation state. I would like them to think it's, oh, we just screwed up and somehow we got yuck on our local, I don't know what ransomware is called. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I think when the tactical use of ransomware, so you're saying like, let's use ransomware, but it's not really ransomware, right? In the sort of not Petya case where there really was no way to pay the ransom. Right?
I think even if there is.
But I really think that if you're going to leverage, wars are really expensive. And I think that when the kinetic stuff hits off, there's a lot of other really smart things that nation states can use that are far more reliable to yield outcomes. And I think that if the COVID response has taught me anything, it's people just crying to get back to normal everyday life is when you can really nick them in the wallet. And that's so I'm not denying the utility of cyber operations overall in kinetic warfare. Cyber enabled kinetic is fine. we're required by law to say cyber. But I think it's an interesting question to think of it in a prolonged conflict environment, and to consider, is that really when people start to grind down on these people are desperately seeking to get their lives back to normal, and so they're more likely to get completely hosed up through cyber operations. I don't know. I'm going to leave that out there. I'm going to stand on this hill and defend it.
Well, so Nino,
ransomware is attrition, but yeah, okay, sorry.
so do you see then the like NotPetya incidents and the Ukraine attacks as being part of this sort of like longer strategy with Russia, in which they're like grinding them down slowly instead of trying to like tactically disrupt something in preparation for another thing?
I mean, again, my views are entirely my own, right? Not the rest of everybody else. But I think that I think it's part of the grinding down, right? The sort of the no matter how ill-advised it is to try and change a political will by attacking a nation, because again, with very few exceptions, does that actually work? But we'll just keep trying, right? It doesn't mean we're not trying. But I think the other thing is just that Ukraine is just tactically useful for experimentation, just very useful for experimentation. And I think that there's a ton of learning going on, and so for that reason, they're benefiting in all sorts of ways.
So I think we've crunched all over some things here, like briefly, right? So first of all, I think that we're making too big a differentiator between ransomware and any other form of denial of service attack. This is just a denial of service attack, and before ransomware, it was the same thing. It was DNS amplification attacks, and hey, Citibank, pay us money, or none of your customers will be able to access your data, right? So whether it's encrypted or not encrypted, it's still just basically a denial of service attack. The primary difference is that with ransomware, it's now not just external customers that can't reach the data, it's internal customers, right? Number one. Number two, there was some mention about nation state versus non-nation state, right? So, in warfare and, when you talk about actions between nations, they talk about the instruments of national power, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, right? And what reliance on networks has done, it's allowed nation state capabilities to reside in individuals or small groups, right? And we're seeing it, misinformation and disinformation. In the 1980s, if you were an American, you want to reach the American audience, you better be the president and tell ABC, CBS, and NBC that, hey, listen, I'm the president, you're going to put me on at prime time, right? Now, Katy Perry just hops on Twitter. She can say whatever the hell she wants, right? Without going through anyone. So I think the whole thing about whether it's a nation state or non-nation state is a false flag, right? There's also an underlying insurance, and I'm sure Silas can tell us all about this, that if you pay the ransom, you're going to get your data back. And there have been lots and lots of cases where that has not been the case.
It is a quintessential business model.
It is a quintessential.
Yeah.
And the really smart folks, what they do is they do a bunch of OSINT on their targets, and they go, what can this company legitimately afford to pay, right? And they do the cost benefit analysis. And if they can afford to pay 10 grand, but not 15 grand, they come in and they go, hey, for $9,999, you can have your data back because I know that's the insurance coverage that you have, right? So
don't build those guys up too much because they do OSINT, but a lot of them are basically like, they're not particularly sophisticated, like they're Gopniks.
Well, they don't have to, right?
Well,
they just have to be like, sophisticated enough.
But the sophisticated people are the ones that run the infrastructure and actually do the massive cash outs. The guys that do the access and interact with the victims saying, like, I'm sure you can pay 200,000. Like we've looked, you've got like this much revenue, you have this many people, you've got offices in 3 different cities. I know you can pay 200,000.
Well, yeah, I mean, the argument you're making is the same argument you make in any business where you've got your salespeople, right? And you've got your management and you've got your technicians, right? It's a business. Under the best case circumstance.
It's more criminal ecosystem. It's less organized. You've got the full range from people who will attack a sizable company, include a copy of their insurance policy and their current turnover figures, and say, this is how we arrived at the size of the ransom. And by the way, we know a lot about you because we exfiltrated all your data. down to guys that because of Corona found that burglaries are a bit harder than usual because everyone's at home all the time. So they've read about the cyber stuff. So they dabble on it on the darknet. You've got the full range. And yeah.
What's the top range? Who are the creme de la creme of ransomware?
Supposedly hospitals have been paying millions, but I don't know for sure.
Okay. Like, is this a business
the
of like
experience I have?
scalability?
Like, all of those like million requests collapse into like sub-million payouts. So someone will be like, we want $10 million, and they'll go like, yeah, like we don't actually have 10 million in cash by Friday. Like that's not going to happen. Like we can get you like 100,000 maybe. Then they'll go, we want $1 million, and it's like, like you've already like chopped off 90% of what they want by just saying like no, and then you can actually start negotiating. So like I've negotiated with some before, and I've spoken to a lot of people who do negotiations. One person told me like they had a small business that like they asked for like 150, and the guy just sent them 5,000. Like they didn't interact at all. It was just like, all right, like here's 5K, and got the key sent to him. They're just like, okay, cool. Like,
I wanted to jump in here. I wanted to just frame a little bit some of the topics we were discussing and then pose a question. So as was mentioned, ransomware is another form of denial of service. It's more of a one action type thing instead of like a constant DDoS attack or something like that. And so it's about controlling assets to get some behavior result. So in the criminal space, we use it for, or I say it is used as a extortion, right? So it's for money. But there is also sort of an analog to this that governments use. And this is getting towards the question I wanted to talk about, is governments sort of do, a ransom in a sense when they freeze assets of foreigners. And then they use that. And yeah, Jenny, I'm going to pose the question to you because you're the one who made me think of this just before this we started talking. So what I wanted to know is, the governments use ransoms in a way to freeze assets to coerce behavior, whether it be, human rights or things like that, not just about money. So instead of the asset being, so anyways, it's about freezing assets to coerce behavior. So what I wanted to pose, the question I want to pose, and let's start with Jenny, is what use are we going to see from governments using ransomware to coerce international behavior in the near future? Go ahead.
Right, and thanks for that, because that's like literally what I'm working on right now with my sort of dissertation. So the sort of set of phenomenon I wanted to talk about is slightly different from what Nina was talking about, which is sort of wartime behavior. So my focus is on sort of what people do in this gray zone area before wars, right? So like everything that Jeremy was talking about, for example, like earlier this year, like Iran like kidnapped or took hostage one of South Korea's oil tankers and said, well, I'm gonna hold this oil tanker unless you unfreeze some of the Iranian financial assets that you've been holding under compliance with US sanctions. And so after a month, Iran released the oil tanker, and South Korea agreed that they're going to unfreeze some of the assets that were frozen under US sanctions. And so this is sort of the context in which I'm thinking about how ransomware could be used by, probably less so US, but more sort of countries like Iran, North Korea. Like if you're thinking about the next Sony that North Korea might want to launch, it'll probably not be reliant on a wiper and more reliant on a ransomware. And the reason why I think that is because, remember back in Sony, when they try to use wipers, they run into this problem of sort of like a credibility versus the sort of the logistics trade-off, right? So if you tell too much about what you plan to do, it sort of alerts the defense. They can pull the plug, get their socks ready and everything, right? So that's going to render the wiper sort of less effective by giving them a heads notice. But if you don't give them any heads up notice, you have no really way to sort of credibly demonstrate that you have this capability and that you can actually unleash all this damage on a target, right? So because of that trade-off, wipers have this sort of problem that they can't really get around. So ransomware gets around that problem entirely because you infiltrate. Yes, you need like deception in the initial sort of access and privilege escalation and all that. But once you encrypt, there's no information problem, right? So you encrypt, you demonstrate your capability, and then the flow cost is going on, and then it's a matter of getting to like you all said, the point of are you going to pay 100K or 1 million? That's sort of like a side problem, right? But the core sort of technology of coercion is entirely different from wipers, and so that's why I think it's going to be a good technology of sieges and torture and kidnapping, and compared to those, which I'm happy to talk about, it's a better technology for doing that. Yeah.
All right. So one of the things is like coercion is an issue that prison gangs, they coerce money out of people, and the way that you need to do it is you have to establish a credible threat. And so like the way that the Mexican mafia operates is when they move into a prison, they just automatically kill like 3 or 4 random people to demonstrate that they will kill people. Like without a problem, they are crazy and they will kill. Then when they go and they try and extort, people know, oh, right, those are the fuckers that just like kill people and don't care. So that's similar to the ransomware versus wiper issue. Like they don't have a ransomware option. So they establish credibility by showing that they're a real threat. So what North Korea would have to do is just every year wipe a few companies just to let everyone know that they will do that. Just sort of keep the level of fear up.
I mean, what is interesting, if you look at the top end of the ransomware gangs, they are trying to present themselves as reliable businesses. They started to issue press releases to say, okay, we've got a new product going. It's so much better than the last one, and they try to sort of establish a corporate image to show we're reliable. Our decryption keys work. With us, you only have to pay once. We don't have another chancer in the chain of our ecosystem that comes straight afterwards and tries to extort you again. This is a business, it's a transaction. Our service is good. We've got a hotline.
Do you ever see them knock other ransomware operators off a network?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Like they'll be like, we are now essentially providing you protection as well as a taxation.
This is a classic like mafia protection racket, right? It's you pay us off and nothing bad will happen to you. You quit paying us, bad things may happen.
That sounds like a good deal. If they can't protect you,
this is exactly like any this is exactly what a state is supposed to provide. You pay your taxes, and they keep bad things from happening to you.
Okay, but sounds great to
when the state fails, you have the mafia, and the mafia says if you pay your taxes, then bad things will happen to you.
That's a bit of an oversimplification, right? Like, yeah, in theory, that's the way it should work, right? That's assuming that you have a friendly outlook of your government, and we Americans have a healthy distrust of ours, right? And hence we've got things like U.S. Title Code 10 and 50 and 18 and 22. I mean, let's assume for a minute, again, personal opinion, that U.S. Cybercom was competent. They still don't have the legal authority to operate within the United States, right?
Can I pay my ransomware operator to take my competitors out? Because now they're operating a foreign policy for me. They're doing some great things. I like this idea.
There's a great example on the UK National Cybersecurity Centre webpage about ransomware, where they have one UK company, they got ransomed, they paid the ransom, and they were so lazy, they never hired somebody to find out how the gang got in. And so 2 weeks later, the same gang comes back, uses the same exploit, ransoms them again and said, okay, you know the drill, and they paid again. So I don't really think they offer security. They offer sort of a one-time service, but they don't give guarantees.
They're brigands. They're not, they're not proto like warlords yet. Like once they've gone from just extorting and squeezing out everything they can to the point where they realize, if we just do this every year, You pay us, well,
Yeah,
how
make it a
about,
long-term
every
business
April
model.
15th or something, you give us some money, and we guarantee that for the next year, you'll be safe.
I think you just made an argument for the Russian business network to be a managed security provider.
I'm looking
We'll call
forward to
them
the.
Enfer?
I'm really looking forward to the Gartner Magic Quadrant review of the Russian business network, where they fall.
You really want to be in Ryuk.
It's at peak hype right now. We're good.
So if this is anything, I am on board with the organized crime model, right? That we seem to be implicitly building up here. And so then we, having done about 3 minutes of research on this, I'm going to speak comprehensively. But if it's like any other service to either extract resources or coerce, and it's not specifically managed well by states, which I think we would agree it's not, or maybe we agree it can be, but I don't think it's gonna. Then it is specifically the role of organized crime to take on. And what you will see then, in theory, right, is a whole bunch of jerkwads who are doing it poorly, and a set of firms that are doing it really well. And eventually that set of firms, whether they're legal or illegal, will start to knock off the jerkwads who are doing it poorly because it's affecting their bottom line and the credibility of getting your data back. So and then eventually, right, different law enforcement agencies that work internationally will come up and they'll say, all right, that's enough. Now we gotta, and it's going to be, if that's the case, then it's going to be well-established, our Russian colleagues, well-established organized crime institutions that are going to be doing it because they've already got the money transfer capabilities. They've already got the pressure in the law. This might just be a new muscle built out by organized crime. We might just see the professionalization of ransomware through organized criminals. I don't know, I guess.
I think the best analogy to understand this is the golden age of piracy in the early 18th century. Because when we sort of watch Pirates of the Caribbean, it's actually just a 25, 30-year period where they had this sweet spot in the Caribbean where they extorted everyone, stole from everyone, and they had the infrastructure. There was a time when they had their own port that was like pirate run and everyone knew it, but they were also welcome in the other ports because a lot of the states that had little colonies there benefited from the association with the pirates because they were all feeding off the big hegemon, the Spanish. And so for a while they were tolerated also because it would have been incredibly expensive to go after them and send ships there. They're expensive. And if you send ships into the Caribbean, half the sailors die of funny diseases. So you want to avoid that if you can. So essentially people accepted that there is piracy and that it's costly, but it was cheaper than doing something about it. And what happened then is they got bigger and bigger and they hit the spot where the first people started writing back to parliaments in London and Paris and saying, guys, this is undermining the business model of slavery. We can't get ships through anymore. We can't get the slaves in. We can't get the money out. This is getting serious. And that is the point when states decided we have to do something. And suddenly the ships were sent and they suddenly passed laws that said if you don't defend against the piracy attack, which many ships' crews didn't do because it didn't make sense, then you go to prison. And there was a new law: if you're a pirate and you convert and you grass out on all the others, then you get a pardon. Yeah? And that was quite comprehensive, and it ended the golden age of piracy in about 2 years. And what I'm assuming is that we are starting to approach towards that pressure point where the cost on global business is getting so high that people start, like us here, start to think seriously about, okay, what could you possibly do to make sure that they can't use Bitcoin anymore, or to raise the price to Russia for essentially offering them a protected space, or what could you do to prevent Southeast Asian states from doing a similar little racket?
Yeah, so like you just touched on, I think what's the critical element of that analogy is that basically you need the people who have power over the groups to take action because no one else has any leverage. Like the victims can't do anything, and the actual protectors to provide them the space to operate are the ones who can say, all right, you guys have to start following these rules, otherwise we kick you out, or we're going to come in and just like slaughter the lot of you. So basically it's only the countries that provide them safe haven that have any ability to coerce their behavior, to alter how they work. And so whatever like we as the West decide to impact and change the way that ransomware works, it's meaningless without buy-in from the people offering protection, right? So in the case of the pirates, I'm pretty sure that Spain was super pissed off and did everything they could to get rid of the pirates, but they had no leverage because they just, it wasn't close enough for them to actually put in, proper forces, all of these things that come together with pre-modern states that make them ineffective. But, pre-modern states that are ineffective is a great way of describing most of the internet. It's not good at governance. So anyway, point being that the only people that can change anything are the states that host these people. And so any leverage we have is against those states to coerce the people that they're protecting.
Can I follow on with a question then? So, which sector do we think is going to cry loudest enough? I suspect it's going to be healthcare, but what sector do we think is going to be the one likely to really start to push? Because it has to affect the sector's bottom line so significantly that they can't, right? What has financial sector done? Pass the cost on to the consumer. And the consumer doesn't realize it because what's $10 more for my fee a year? So what sector is likely to actually start pushing? And if it is the healthcare sector, how it's unclear to me how much control they actually have. I don't know if we have anybody who can speak to that.
Yeah. So I think that's a loaded question. And I think just like what's pointed out with piracy, I think the sector that's going to push back is going to be the insurance, because they're the ones that are having to pay out. And so the way that you'll typically see this, right, it's the same thing we saw for cyber attacks, is that they get tired of paying out. And so they're going to leverage requirements on their customers to do better.
The funny thing is we had a turning point here, because especially in the US, the insurers used to encourage people to pay the ransom because that was much cheaper than paying for like the whole new system setup. So there were even insurance policies that say, don't go to law enforcement, go to our guy if you're hit by ransomware. And that is now changing, and because they get pressure from the reinsurers who are getting the final bills for saying, actually, we're not enjoying our cyber portfolios anymore with all these ransomware costs. So some are now excluding ransomware as a coverage, but that is unpopular. Customers don't like that at all. So they're thinking about for next year, they're going to raise the premiums by about 30%. And then we're going to hear a lot of crying out loud. That is the point. The reinsurers are the ones who are starting to think very seriously about this right now.
So I'll challenge this, because I think that, I mean, the insurers, like they're going and insuring cyber related incidents. Like this is not an unusual type of attack. This is something that's seen every day. They're expecting it. They're planning for it. They're preparing for it. Like I think until we see like actually multiple businesses go out from ransomware attacks in a way that it actually disrupts a sector. So for example, like with the recent administration's push to do a entirely domestic chip supply chain, if that supply chain is like 3 entities in the US, which I'm grossly exaggerating at the moment, but say 2 of them get knocked out because of a ransomware attack, and the third one is kind of like just paying their every month piso to the Ryuk, like that's going to be one of those things where it's like, we're going to see this industry fall in the US because of ransomware. Like, and I think when that happens, like either their voices won't be loud enough to have an impact, or it will actually try and drive some of the change.
So my basis for saying it was the insurances, look at what happened with Target, right? When Visa and MasterCard and the insurance industry said, Target, you did not do due diligence, we're not covering your losses, right? And the stock price took a hit and the CEO got fired. Then all of a sudden, retail went, hey, you know what, that PCI DSS thing, it may be kind of important, right? So this is going to be one of those things. I think that the business model that's kind of missing from this, not that I want to give the bad guys any ideas, is in some cases, it's not the attack that's damaging. It's letting the public know that you've been breached. So at what point is it, listen, pay us X and we'll give you the decryption keys, pay us X plus Y and we'll make sure it doesn't end up on Facebook and Twitter, right? Because your stock price is going to tank and you're going to lose far more than you would by paying our ransom.
So they sort of actually have that already implemented right now in like the as a service frameworks. Like basically you get told, all right, you have 10 days to contact us and pay this amount. And then after 10 days, we will publish our, on our internal page on whatever, on, Onion, on Tor, and people will see that your data will be made available in 7 days after that if you don't pay. And so what they do as well is they say like, pay before, the 10th day and it's, 100, but pay after and it's 200.
Yeah, I think this combination that they're starting to do, combining ransomware with blackmail over exfiltrated information, I think that's really interesting. And in some way, I think it undercuts their ability to extract ransom because, once they exfiltrated the data, that creates a commitment problem in itself, right? Like, so they can sell the data back to the victim, but they can, because, it's not an excludable good, they can also sell it to some other third party to the highest bidder and do that multiple times. And there's no real good commitment device that says, we'll only sell it back to you for this price, but not to anybody else. So, I mean, it's going on as a practice, but I don't necessarily think it's sort of benefiting the attackers.
It increases their value to their hosts, though, because if you are an intelligence unit of a state and you are sort of protecting cyber criminals and they suddenly have all this data that they've stolen from really interesting companies, you might want to tap them on the shoulder and say, okay, you do your extortion thing, but I want that data.
So I think there's like a bunch of interesting things happening there. One of them is that the move to, so like ransomware was always just a means of doing extortion. It happened to be that ransom, with encryption and decryption was the first implementation they had. And then when it became like technically the response to a encrypted disk is you restore from backups. And so it became possible to bypass that. They weren't able to do effective coercion. Then they added this, exfiltrate and extort. And I think, as Jan was just saying, that's so like it's done a few things. As Jenny said, it's made it a lot harder for them to say like, all right, you've paid us, we've all washed our hands of this, we're done. It's a clean break. Everyone's happy and we go on with our lives. It's harder to say that when you have to say, okay, look, I know I broke in and I stole all your stuff and I trashed everything, but trust me, now that you've given me money, I'm going to be a good guy and uphold my end of the bargain, right? Like that's a much harder sell all of a sudden. But at the same time, I think it's probably very important to them in terms of their longevity as a business or as an economy, because until they provide actual value to the state. So right now, the value that they provide is they get money from outside and they spend it locally. Like the people that are doing the crime are buying Lamborghinis, which means that money is going to like car dealerships and petrol stations and rent and vodka and ramen noodles and things like that. So like there's that, but that's not a huge thing if the US starts going, all right, look, we're gonna throw sanctions at you unless you stop this. The state's gonna go like, oh, do we lose that, $100 million a year sector of the economy? Yeah, okay, fine, it's gone. But by moving to extortion, it now gives them not just a revenue angle, it's got all this data that they're bringing in, which makes them actually useful for like the intelligence services. And I think that is probably their hook to avoid being crushed. So,
all right, let me take this from the opposite direction. because I think we make this very annoying, I don't know, continuation of thinking that what happened in the 1800s is what's going to happen with the cyber domain. And I just don't think that's the case, not to annoy the historian who is our esteemed guest. But if you take as an assumption that this is going to engender new forms of governance and new forms of coercion that are going to be between states and private industries, between states and individuals, then I think we're seeing some elements of that newness seep into the practice now, right? Like that's what I think is interesting about, like, say, Jenny's research, is that we can see some of the glimmers of the beginning of what a new structure looks like that's post-Westphalian in some aspects.
Okay, I wanted to sort of follow up with some of the things Dave was saying. It was just over 10 years ago the book was published, Malicious Cryptography, and I was friends with a black hat at the time, and he told me, wait till people find out about this. I'm so glad people haven't read this book yet, and forecast a decade forward. And of course, we're now having a discussion about government financial sanctions and insurgent industry. Basically, this has become such an analytical discussion. You can introduce game theory of what is the correct choice to make, what is the expected value. I mean, this is taken a lot of the kind of drawing on something that Nina said about like low intensity conflict. Like what's lesser intensity than doing mathematical calculations to make a decision for what you're going to do? You don't have fear. You don't have like any sort of violence. You don't have anything that's like stressful. I mean, of course it's stressful, but I just mean like we're talking about something that is so well controlled that we're talking about industries and possibly future financial instruments to do trading based on however the rise of Bitcoin is affected by ransomware and things like that. So I wanted to pose a question which Dave was saying we're sort of getting to, which is like, okay, 10 years from now, what are we going to see with ransomware? And I know it's a hard question to answer, but I figured, let's start with that. I mean, there's the weirdest, craziest thing you could say. So Pablo introduced the idea of using the market value of perception of a company, as further way to extract value from a company. But I wanted to hear what else are we going to see that this is going to evolve into? Because we have a good state of where things are now. Yeah, Jenny, and then Jan.
So one thing that could happen in terms of how states might use it, and not all of it is bad. Everyone thinks coercion is bad, but it can also be used for good too, right? So first, you can imagine situations like it could be used to dismantle sort of an international sanctions regime, right? U.S. wants to sanction Iran and needs the cooperation of all these other states in order to implement that. And if you're Iran or North Korea, if you can sort of take one country off bit by bit by using things like ransomware, create a mutual hostage situation and say, well, you unfreeze my assets in your Chilean bank or something, and then I unfreeze your assets, your chemical plant or your energy sector or something like that, and then make those trade-offs and then sort of pick off the weakest links in the international sanctions regime. That's one thing in the far future that you can think of. Another thing you can do is, Jan mentioned the international law on like state responsibility. Like it could be used as a countermeasure, right? If they're doing something wrong and bad, because ransomware is reversible, unlike bombs, right? You're not destroying assets. It's reversible. That's a really good tool for countermeasures. So it's not all bad, I think.
So like what you're saying is there's a sense of proportionality. This munition, right, this tactic is so controlled that you can say, okay, you've frozen my assets. Now I'm going to freeze your healthcare data. And I'm not attacking you. There's no blood spill, but we both have things on the line. I need money to make food. I have food and you need your healthcare data to do whatever. So that really introduces it into more of the chess game instead of like missiles and bombs and, the far end of the spectrum. But Jan, you had something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, building on Jenny's point, there was something in an EU declaration from April, and when the pandemic really started, that said states have a due diligence duty to prevent cyber criminals in their territory from attacking healthcare organizations. That wasn't part of international law before they issued that declaration in that specific form, but it shows you what they're starting to think about in terms of building the case for attributing blame to states that shelter these groups of criminals. But if I want to make the bold prediction, what's going to happen, we're going to look at Bitcoin, we're going to look at cryptocurrencies, we're going to look at that part of the criminal ecosystem where they make their money and where the money goes from Western companies to those state havens that protect them. That is their weak spot, and that is where some really interesting conceptual stuff might happen, because Western central banks think about digital currencies. The Chinese are thinking about digital currencies very, very hard. They're starting to suppress Bitcoin because the Bitcoin mining in Chinese coal fields is starting to undermine Chinese climate goals. I mean, that's the kind of world we're in right now.
So we're talking about proportionality in warfare, and we're also talking about a direct challenge to fiat currency, which is, those are major challenges to established order. I mean, the entire woven throughout this entire conversation is digital currency, exchange of value, proportionality, warfare, things like that. And that brings us, I think, to this topic, which, you know, I asked the question, what are we going to see 10 years from now? So Dave brings it up, the post-Westphalian order. Who wants to jump in? How about Pablo? You want to talk about, for the viewers, talk about Westphalian order so we can have this discussion.
I'm feeling triggered, and we're going to go down this rabbit hole and never emerge, right? So for the vast majority of people that didn't have to suffer through reading the Treatise of Westphalia, basically most international laws are still based on it, right? And so there are kind of three rules there of, hey, every nation is in control of their own internal affairs, and that no country should interfere with the internal affairs of another country, and that all countries are equal regardless of size, which sounds nice in theory, but it doesn't really work. The other problem is that this is based solely on physical boundaries and lines on a map, right? And so I almost wish we could share the chat with the public, and I'm kind of glad that we can't. But you know, when you hear people talking about anarchy, they talk about tearing down the establishment. And I'm going to suggest that anarchy doesn't happen when you tear down the government. Anarchy happens when individuals have the same power as the government. So the ability to reach mass audiences used to belong to governments, now it belongs to individuals. The ability to print currency used to belong to governments. Now we've got Bitcoin and Dogecoin and you name it, right? Cryptocurrency. The ability to, you know, raise a military, right? Well, you know, if you want to raise a, you know, quote unquote cyber military, there's plenty of people out there for hire. So if you go to BitNation, they don't exist in physical space, yet they will provide you a birth certificate, a marriage certificate, a passport. By the way, it's recognized by the EU, right? And they have physical embassies throughout the world. So I don't know, define nation state for me now in this post-Westphalian world in which we live.
All right, let me recap some of this stuff. Then Nina, I saw you have a lot of reaction, so I think we need to hear what you're going to say. So the Westphalian order is centered around states, heads of state, not individuals like the previous 10,000 years. You have like might makes right. You know, you have private armies, fiefdoms, warlords, things like that. We have now foreign nations attacking individual companies and then extorting them. So like North Korea is a good example. Direct challenges now in the challenge of a foreign nation attacking individuals, those individuals having to take out private insurance because their taxes and their defense are not taking care of it. Intertwined into that interaction is now a direct challenge to fiat currency. And now we're talking about proportionality of freezing assets of possibly hacktivists against foreign governments. I mean, we're talking about if we want to talk about 10 years from now, the degradation of the Westphalian order, I mean, we're discussing it as we speak right now. I hope I capture that. Okay, Nina, let's hear it.
All right, I'm going to push back a little bit. So one, and just building a little bit off the prior so we don't get too far away from ransomware, we should remember that although these tools enable a lot of people, right, certain entities are better equipped to deal with the costs than others. And so even just purely within the landscape of countries, let's remember that there's also Namibia and maybe Ghana and also Cote d'Ivoire and the United States and China and Russia, right? So the degree to which we can predict what's going to happen to ransomware as a tool of state power, we should be careful because some countries will not be able to suffer it better than others. And so therefore you're likely to see a lot of action, regardless of whether or not you think it's effective or not, at the UN level, at the international law level, within the General Assembly, having conversations about the appropriateness and maybe inculcate some norms of non-use or whatever. But the other thing that I want to be careful is this. So the Treaty of Westphalia, I forget who said it before, right? But you've actually read it. It almost bears nothing compared to, it's everybody dealing with like how many goats that got stolen in the last border clash. But probably a more up-to-date reading of what sovereignty is, what states sort of control over what happens inside its borders, is I forget who wrote, Krasner, who wrote this book called Organized Hypocrisy, which is that sovereignty never really was what we thought it was, right? Which is that at some point we make it possible for states to trade, which means we give up some control. We make it possible for states to have shared treaties, which means we give up some control. So I think we shouldn't sort of overstate the strength of what we think sovereignty is and its going to control. What I do think is that states do, and now I'll just get all postmodern on you. I do think that governments, right, are structured so as to self-preserve. And if you can't control, and they're structured generally around geography. And so if you can't stop the international system from moving money around, what do? You crush your citizens. You force them to pay it up. Right. And so maybe that's part of what we're seeing in the rush to autocracy, right? Is like, all right, screw the citizens and their voice. I'm going to start putting I'm going to start punishing the thing I can punish. I'm going to start controlling the thing I can't punish. And so I'm not sure that's a reduction in sovereignty. I think that's just an increase in making the little guy pay. And I'd be worried about that. I mean, I think that's a worse outcome by far. That's me going way postmodern. And again, I'll defend this hill, but I'm not sure I even believe what I just said.
No. I think what you said is great. So I'm going to chime in here now with something. So when we talk about, like you said, the state sort of crushing the individual, I want to highlight, power is a zero-sum game. The more power the individual has, then the less the state will have over the individual. And one of the things that we haven't talked about, we talked about sort of the lowering of the power of the state through, currency circumvention, circumventing things like that. And what has been happening in the background of this discussion here is not really the state is losing power, but rather individuals are gaining power. The fact that I, as an individual person, can now circumvent, international sanctions based on some ones and zeros on my computer. The fact that I can get together a team of 20 people and then turn the power off in Namibia, and maybe they can't force to pay my ransom. And now all of a sudden, my group of 20 people, we're not just the pirates in the Caribbean anymore. We are like a full fleet, that has materialized and scaled hockey stick growth of, aggression internationally. And I think that's one of the things that I think what cyberspace and the nature of control and power in cyberspace has really done is it's empowered the individual. What Pablo said is like about the sovereignty is drawn around geographical borders. And what has cyberspace done? It's destroyed international borders, with some exceptions of people trying. And the destruction of international borders and just sort of like having people, it feels like sometimes fending for themselves. Like, who do I call when North Korea attacks all my private business? It's like, do I call my local FBI field office? It's like, they tell me to call my insurance company. It's like, okay, well, I guess I'm sort of fending for myself here. But that was one of the things I wanted to introduction. So that was a bit all over, but I wanted to introduce the empowering of the individual is what is challenging the current sovereignty and the current state order. So Dave, then Jan.
So there's something about this that always cracks me up, which is that if you look at how Bitcoin started, it was for buying drugs. And the drug war has been an amazing failure on the part of all states who fit this model in terms of fulfilling their customers' needs. Essentially, their customers want to buy a bunch of drugs and use those drugs, and the states don't want them to for whatever cultural reasons. And it's 1% of global GDP that goes into drugs. And that's where Bitcoin came from. It's the same amount that goes into buying oil. Like, if you could only buy gas for your car with a special coin, then that coin would be everywhere, right? Like, that's just the reality of how this works. So if I can only get drugs via a special coin, then yes, it's everywhere. And now all the banks have to jump in on it. That adds to the legitimacy. That's like it germinates this entire cornstalk that we can climb up into ransomware and, non-state actions and all this excitement. And I think the only thing I would push back on Jenny's prediction is I think the timelines are far too long. Like I honestly think we're looking at 2 to 5 years and not 10 years. And that's my only.
10 years was my fault. I threw that out there.
I totally blame you because otherwise she was right on. But like that, I would say that it's interesting to see how we get to these places, and it's because we failed somewhere else in a colossal way.
Yeah, I love the war on drugs. I think by now we can just call it prohibition. Total market manipulation of making something illegal and then funding trying to fight it while our US citizens also fund trying to buy it. So it's sort of like this absurd situation, which eventually will hopefully rectify itself, much like alcohol prohibition did. But go ahead, Jan.
Okay, I mean, the really interesting thing about cyberspace right now is the role of not just the individual, but the private actor, the private person and the private company. And historically, I mean, you had privateers and mercenaries who sort of contributed as equals in war. And we're going to see that at some point if we have great power conflict. I mean, the Russians are going to co-opt these people. And I know for a fact that some Western states go to prisons and talk to cyber criminals and think, okay, might you want to be interested in a career with the forces? This is happening. And the moment war happens, they'll be recruited en masse. And they're going to be even more independent actors. And the other fascinating thing on the other angle is the power of the big tech companies. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, some big tech companies are now more powerful than states, and to see it in action in Australia being told what's what, by Facebook. And another example with ransomware is the TrickBot takedown. The United States did that and said, well, these are Russian cyber criminals. They do ransomware, but we have reasons to believe they might cooperate with the Russian state in taking down the US election, which is why we're taking down their servers. And at the same time, the Microsoft Digital Crimes Unit, just think about it. Microsoft has a digital crimes unit full of ex-prosecutors and cops, prosecuting crimes. They start an organized takedown of TrickBot, and we don't even know whether this is coordinated or coincidence or who's doing what, but like a private company is taking down organized crime servers in another country and just sort of tweets about it.
I think we've pulled this thread pretty far here. We've said ransomware has sprung up. It's now prevalent amongst criminals. We introduced it as possibly a tool of statecraft because it is effective. And then we talked about, okay, if now civilians are having to defend themselves against these tools, and now we're all the way to corporate power rising in the post-Westphalian order, and it's all because here is this tool that basically the government is not stopping, and so who shouldn't be racing to use this tool? It's like a free-for-all right now. The rise of, like you said, private criminal investigation units or mercenaries. There was even a discussion, there's always a discussion every 2 years, I think, on cyber privateers, letters of marque, because basically there's a problem the government's not solving. And so basically the market is solving it. And I think that the intermingling here of ransomware as a tool of coercion, the integration of digital currency as just a necessity of this tool, it all points to the sort of like this challenge to state power. So I don't really know where we supposed to go from here. Is the government going to step in, or are we going to evolve into what you see sometimes in sci-fi movies where you're now on corporate sovereign territory? If anyone's ever seen like a dystopian sci-fi film, right? It's like the corporation has now risen to that point where it has citizens, it defends them, it attacks on their behalf, it has its own currency. And it's like all of a sudden, if we are living and breathing in cyberspace, do I really care so much about the people with the guns and the tanks and the fences and things like that? So I mean, the last question was posed is, where do we see ourselves in 10 years? Does anybody want to propose shaping the next 10 years? I mean, what should we be doing now to address currently an unsatisfactory state I would say we're in? Yeah, Jan.
Okay, I'd project a split of the tech giants into sort of Chinese, US evil, as in Facebook, trying to monopolize their position and basically projecting power towards the state, and private actors that try to become the state through the means of charities. So if you look at what happened to the big oil giants, like or the big corporate giants in the US like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and so on, they sort of withdrew and founded charities, and these charities became incredibly influential in US foreign policy and global policy. And I think this is Microsoft's next step. They're just going to build up a massive charity that sorts out peace in cyberspace. And lo and behold, they have just founded the Cyber Peace Institute in Geneva, right next to the United Nations. We're going to see a lot more organized efforts from that.
We talk about
and we're going to see the split of the big tech giants. That's what's going to happen.
I mean, talking about cyber peace, I mean, ransomware is inherently non-violent. That's one of the great things about cyberspace is people don't have to get hurt. They can get hurt based on the, ransoming of resources and such. So you brought up corporate sovereignty, and I want to try to connect that back to the original premise of the discussion, ransomware. We talk about hacking back for corporations as a way to defend themselves. What about corporations using ransomware in some sort of legal way? Like, and here's just like this off the wall, like if I was doing a pen test and I needed to prove I could get access to certain assets, could I ransomware an organization and then give them the keys and be like, okay, look, this is what we achieved. Now you can totally demonstrate, here was your backup pipeline. This is where it failed. This is where I had access to. Are we going to see any legitimate uses of ransomware for corporations?
We already do.
What happens every year when I get the notification from O365? It says you have to pay another year of your subscription, or we're going to take away all the services we provide you. I mean, isn't that essentially what it is? Sorry, just putting that out there.
Absolutely, and I would even go so far. As I spent a couple hours last night. So I've got 2 old Pixel phones. Both are bootloader locked. The only way to unlock them is to have been a preferred Google vendor or partner. I do not own this hardware as I see it. And even in a lot of cases, with the really wacky cases where it's you may, like I may physically own this product, but I don't own this product. I simply own a license to operate it. I would argue as a degree of ransomwaring, because the only way, like my behavior is being coerced because I'm not willing to pay a financial thing. Or
DRM as ransomware.
I mean, literally that's Apple and Fortnite right now. Like, is there a better example of ransomware being used than you cannot install something on your own phone because it's heavily encrypted and you have no access to it, and the customer base is being held to extort and coerce behavior from the company that produces it, right? I mean,
okay,
yeah.
So we have the idea of influence and business models, subscriptions as a service. Nina said, I'm paying a subscription to host my data, and if I don't pay it, I don't get my data anymore. So that feels like extortion. Although we have to draw some lines here. I don't know who's the legal scholar here, but we have
it's tax.
We have
so
taxes
it's
and
very
incentive
it's
models.
literally the way that. So if we're going to talk about that, then we have to say that is exactly the way that the mafia works, right? If you pay Google, then you don't have a problem with your data. And if you pay like Vinny, then you don't have a firebomb thrown through your front window. It's the exact same thing. The reason that, yes, because typically what happens is they don't actually escalate to burning you down. What they do is they kidnap you because it is reversible. It's non-violent. The way that most kidnapping actually happens is not. It's not like you see in like the Middle East when someone's kidnapping like an American journalist or whatever. What typically happens is like the bad guys go to your house, they take you, they take you somewhere and they say, all right, look, we've gone through your assets. We see that you couldn't pay us, $500 a week. And so why don't you pay us that? And this doesn't have to escalate. You agree that, and they let you go home. And as long as you pay, there is no escalation. And that is, as far as I can tell, literally the exact same thing that governments do, is they
let's draw
taxes in exchange for protection.
Let's draw a distinction here between subscription and ransom. Okay, there may be similar mechanics, but there's got to be some legality, some ethics involved here that distinguish
legalities are imposed by the state. And what does the state do? It says, if you do not abide by this, we will punish you. They use force to impose legalities.
That is a
Right?
radical
So law
view.
is literally just another
Google
form
is
of
a
ransom.
ransomware gang. Okay, let's just publish that at the end of this. Jan, you got something?
Yeah, I think we've got a pretty good comparison, namely Italy in the 1970s, where organized crime started to go really big into the kidnapping system. It was really bad for the reputation of the state, and they made enormous amounts of money kidnapping people all over Italy, hiding them in southern Italy, and then receiving them after big ransoms. And that is the worrying thing is what they did next, because that gave them the capital to set up all these cocaine running routes from South America that are incredibly difficult to set up logistically, that are the model of their current business, the foundation of their current business. So if you want to think about the future, with all this money coming in, what are the ransomware gangs going to do? So I know from what the Klopp gang is going to do, is they're going to buy 0 days, but are they going to extort states? Are they going to fuse with the mafia? What's the next thing?
So what's literally happening is the majority of the money that's coming in is not being kept by the gangs. It's going to their roofs. Like the cliche gets to keep almost everything. And that's actually one of the reasons that you see that the reason that the access for pay business even exists is because the costs and the risks of handling a huge amount of money from a ransom are like very, very dangerous. If you don't have a roof, then you're just going to get robbed or you're going to get arrested. So it's a lot easier to, break in somewhere and then sell for $5,000 to someone who does have a roof. And then they can work with their roof and get a big payout, right? If you're like Vasha, like the random dude on the street who wants to make some money, go ahead and break into some places and then sell that access. If you run a illegal Bitcoin exchange, then you have connections with the authorities that are providing protection, and you're paying a huge amount. So it's all like the way that it ends up working out is that the money is not actually going to these autonomous entities that can do whatever they want. It's not the mafia, because they are they're more of a business unit inside of a mafia. They're generating revenue, but they don't actually have autonomy and control over how the resources get allocated after they brought it in.
So
when we started this conversation, go ahead, Silas, go.
So I have a theory I want to kick over to that. And it was kind of making me think about it as you were talking about like access brokering and things like that. But in general, one of the things I was kind of thinking is perhaps like the intersection that we've talked about in some areas about like intersecting with like collection operations and stealing information and ransomware, how like they sometimes fit together, but inherently it seems like they're actually complete opposites. So the thing is if say like Ryak was dropping stuff, they're probably only going to collect as much data as they need in order to like show that they've got stuff before they do a ransom, like before they ransom and lock everything. And the thing is if part of they're paying money up for protection from their governments to continue their operations, intrinsically, like ransomware is not the business group that you want to be working with for these things. Like, because if they like that pulling of data and that actually like collecting of things is probably the most vulnerable point in their operation. Like that's when they're going to get caught. So they can't really be tasked, probably can't be tasked really reliably to grab specific things. So
absolutely not at all. That's an excellent point, right? That like, because the guys that are doing this are they tend to be like the least savvy, because they're literally like, what can I find out? How can I get in? And how can I flip this for like enough money to buy vodka and pay rent for the rest of the month, right? Like they're not looking for, how will this be useful for, the tasking that was given last month by my case officer? Like that's not a thing. So I don't know. I think though the downside from that is once they do provide access, which is almost always just like RDP to an AD that happened to be, on the internet. But once they do provide access, then the people who are going to then be sort of going on from that, they're the ones who do directly interface with the case officers, because that's where they get their roof.
Because I mean, I was thinking to myself, like, all it takes is them pushing out like a PowerShell script that searches for like classified top secret TSSCI, and all of a sudden like all of the signatures being like, you have rogue Kaspersky antivirus running. like starts firing off and the entire operation's blown. So had to get that squishy joke.
So we're seeing, I mean, a lot of, lively discussions recently about access as a service. And what seems like another next step in evolution here of one-time ransomware hits is denial of access as a service or access as a service to your own data. So we're going to hit you up monthly, evolving, more towards more the mafia extortion model, where instead of it being a one-time thing, it's like, look, I'm going to invest my 10 red teamers, and they're going to come every month after you unless you pay me this payment model. And if people can justify paying it once, you're going to be able to put it into your budget line item monthly. Like, okay, I'll pay my protection racket because clearly the government is failing to protect me, and they're the ones who are directly posing a threat. So are we seeing that out there already? Am I already like behind on this? Jenny, I've seen you had some reactions to this. What's your opinion on denial of access as a service?
I don't know if it has happened yet. I know that North Korea has like done protection rackets, but I don't know if it's like in the context of ransomware. I think it just comes down to like a trade-off, right? It's either a one-time exchange of a lump sum, or you divide that lump sum over many periods, presumably because you have these commitment problems and reputational concerns where you can't be trusted to make that one-time exchange. So you do salami tactics and break it out over time. I think it's just a matter of that. So if you do a one-time sort of lump sum exchange, presumably, the ransomware gang has to probably make some sort of assurance that they won't come back a second time, probably by, showing them how they got in and how they can patch that hole and blah, blah, blah. But if that's not there, and if that can't be done, then perhaps the monthly payment system is a better arrangement for both of them.
I mean, here are the actors that I know of are in this space already. So I pay a yearly subscription to my own government to help protect me against other countries. And then for a business, I pay some subscription to my endpoint threat detection platform. So I pay that subscription service, and then the ransomware still hits me up for the one-time fee. And it's like, where's my investment best going to go? Could I take some of my tax money and just pay it directly to the people if the government is going to accept this as my problem anyways? So there's all these actors out here, and it's like, it's just a battle royale. And I'm just some Joe Schmo citizen trying to do my business. And it's like, this needs to change, because I feel like I'm on a train in the Wild West and bandits are riding alongside me and asking me for my jewelry. And it's like, hey, where is the taxation, going here? And I didn't think we were going to get here, but as Greg mentioned earlier, drawing the equivalence, I didn't think in this discussion we were going to get to the point of taxation as a form of theft, which is far radical, but we got there. So that's unexpected.
Listen,
thank you for that surprise.
I need to get everyone on board with my ideas.
Yeah,
we cited Nietzsche like 40 minutes ago, so we've already entered some areas.
Okay, thank you. Nina, you had some reactions about the different actors: government, FireEye, extortion gangs, and people's legitimacy is just up for a free-for-all here.
I'm just thinking about, I'm sorry, the chat is hilarious. I'm super glad, or somebody else who said, I'm super glad people can't see what's happening in the chat. So, no, I love the rage, right? I love the sort of this individual consumer, you think you're paying for some set of services. You think you're doing all the right things and still you're getting hit, and you're asking, where's my recourse, right? It's not, if you want to be made whole, right? It's about harm, and for most citizens, it's about being made whole again. It's about harm and being made whole, right? And I don't know, I would imagine that over time, well, like anything else, people who can afford to get good protection will pay for it, and everybody else who can't afford to won't. Although I'm starting to think that the individual states in the United States may be doing better and worse jobs at providing recourse for harm, but I'm not sure. I know this is true in a number of other services that the state is supposed to be providing, right? And we know that in the shakedown of trying to figure out how to do coronavirus, or in the shakedown trying to figure out how to do social services or any of that, states are performing varyingly. And I wonder if we're going to see variation, not at the state level, I would imagine. Well, maybe. North Dakota apparently is kicking ass, not that anyone lives there. But we may see people who sign on to, maybe it just becomes part of my subscription, to Microsoft. Maybe that gets packed in there. right? I bought this computer, I buy these internet services, and therefore my recourse comes through them. And so you'll see people glomming into spaces where they have actual recourse. I don't know. It's a good guess.
I mean, it is an unfortunate state that we're openly discussing a protection market for basically what most of our lives depend on, which is the exchange of information. And so that's why we're talking about all these things: ransomware, digital currency. I mentioned hackback about 10 minutes ago, and Pablo, you were shaking your head as far as corporations being able to retaliate for people coming for them. I think if anything is going to happen, before the government grants me some license to hack, it's going to be done to some corporations first. But what's your opinion on that for protection? Corporations protecting themselves?
Yeah, so I hate that we picture it as corporations protecting themselves. So I'll say a couple of things. The number of corporations that have the technical schlitz to go toe to toe with a PLA, I can count on one hand. Number one. Number two, there's that whole attribution problem, right? What happens when a company hacks back and they hit the proverbial, baby formula factory? Right now, who's responsible? If government lawyers aren't allowing for this, I can't imagine that corporate lawyers are really going to be on board. And for better or worse, lawyers have become a decision-making authority rather than an advisory authority. I think the whole idea of corporations hacking back is just bad in almost every case.
Yeah, a lot of dangers there. And I think what was forecasted earlier from Grug about the Pirates in the Caribbean, maybe Jan, about look, people are going to tolerate so much ransomware until it gets to a point, and then people are going to say, something's got to be done here. Something has to change because I can't just write this off every year as part of my insurance. Something needs to change. And
I think
outlawing hacking back.
Yeah, I think Nina hit the nail on the head, right? So I mentioned, handful of companies that would have the technical schlitz. So who am I talking about? Talking about Amazon, I'm talking about Google, but talking about Microsoft. So like Nina said, look, if I pay for a Microsoft Azure subscription and I get hit with ransomware, I'm going to go back to Microsoft and go, what am I paying you for, right? I'm paying you a service to offload my IT needs onto you because you're supposed to be better at this than I am, and you're not providing that level of service. Right. The whole idea of cloud infrastructure is, reduce most companies' IT cost by giving it to somebody that's going to do it better, faster, cheaper, and safer. And if you're not providing that service, then your cloud provider services are just they're gonna evaporate. They're gonna go to somebody else.
If we talk about cloud server environments, what we're talking about is basically every cloud server has the right to control the data within their own cloud. All clouds are basically equal, and no cloud is allowed to mess with the data inside someone else's cloud. Is that roughly right? I mean, because that's pretty Westphalian.
Well, so the thing that often with a lot of the cloud providers as well is if you approach, insert cloud hosting provider here, they're a platform, they're not a solution. They will not make you can't approach them and say, I want to do this as a business, and they will deliver that business to you. They are a platform to enable things. But just in that sense of being a platform that makes them neutral, it also makes it so that they do not provide security. And it then goes back to the insurance debate of you didn't lock down your Elasticsearch server, and clearly that's why all of your instances or indexes are all now ransomware. So that's the tricky thing is they're not offering guarantees with it. And much of this is dependent on almost a guarantee. So even if you went back to Microsoft and said, what the fuck? My laptop got locked by Riot, they're going to be we don't offer guarantees of that. So
what happens when this goes sort of full circle? It gets to the point that in order to raise taxes, you start having IRS ransomware. It'll go out and be all right, it's getting to the time of year when you're going to have to pay your however much % of your income for the last 12 months. And if you want to have access to your stuff again, then, do it at irs.onion.
But so let me just ask a really loaded question here, right? We pay taxes. Part of the taxes, at least the United States, go to fund the military. The military is there to protect the U.S. populace from external threats. So is a hacker that lives in a foreign nation an external threat?
Yeah, you're asking the question about borders now, like
is
cyberspace borders.
If China,
who's the first person to get droned for hacking?
Well, I think the droning needs to be RM. Like, I think there's a policy case to be made that U.S. steel industry as a whole should get the U.S. government to conduct an RM-RF operation against China Steel for essentially destroying the entire U.S. steel market. Like, that's a thing that happened. There's been no repercussions. And it's a valid use of ransomware. Like, maybe we should be just extracting attacks as U.S. Steel from the Chinese steel market. Like, everyone who buys steel gets ransomware. We take, a percentage, and that's our compensation for them stealing our technology and outcompeting us with that.
I'd like to highlight the name of the group, Glasshouse, before we start suggesting we're going to RM-RF everybody.
Well, let's just think about a different impact of criminality on the state. If you look at the cocaine trade we mentioned before, and its impact on certain Latin American states as entities, they're in real trouble. They've lost the monopoly of violence on the street. They're struggling to fight corruption because the enemy has much more money and power than they have in certain areas. And in Latin America and in West Africa, there are certain states that are sort of on the brink of being no longer state-governed proper entities, and that's because of criminal action. And if you think ransomware to the end, to the point when most normal companies really struggle to do business anymore because they're getting hit all the time by ever sophisticated crime gangs using zero days like it's nobody's business, then someone's gonna raise the question, can someone do a better job? And then we have the, 2028 election, Brad Smith of Microsoft against Zuckerberg of Facebook, with like different visions on how private companies can secure American cyberspace. I mean, who knows?
All right. So this has been a vigorous hour and a half. I can say it's my personal pleasure to just participate in all this. I was just signaled on the internal chat here to start an outro here. I'm not making these decisions. I'm just in the show, not running it. So that's all the time we have for today. Hour and a half. We could definitely talk all day, and we definitely want to. I know a couple people are going to like hit us up afterwards and be like, I have 2 more hours of things that you need to hear from me. So it's been an energetic conversation as usual, which has been great. One thing I want to say is, which was mentioned in the internal chat here, was that this has been a very US-centric conversation. And one of the things that I love about this group is that that's always recognized. It's like, hey, look, this is a limitation that this has been US-centric. Let's try to expand and let's talk to other people. So everybody in this chat here has some sort of public presence. I know because I had to search out everyone's bios beforehand. So I type in their name and then I type space cyber. And it's usually just like the first hit on Google. And they have like they have a profile picture, and like, so you can reach out to them. Also, there's the Twitter account, and there's obviously the Twitch stream. But what I would like to do is I'd like to get more international participants, because I'd love pushback on all this stuff, all the stuff we've talked about. Nobody here is adverse to conflict or disagreement. And I think everybody here has been very respectful in agreeing and disagreeing with different people's opinions. So it's called Glasshouse OpenCall for that very reason, is because it doesn't have to be a formal thing. You don't have to have 7 titles after your name. You just got to have some competence and some willingness to discuss everything. So thanks everybody for joining us today. You can reach the speakers through their various social networking handles. And the videos will be uploaded to YouTube. I think it takes like an hour or 2. Silas, it's usually same day? Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So with that, let me just defer to Greg here. Any last things you want to say to the folks back home?
No, that's about it. So thanks for joining us. We plan on having another one of these very soon. I think maybe the Thursday time doesn't work as well as the Friday time, to be honest. So maybe next week we'll do another one, particularly if something comes up that's interesting. I know that there are other groups out there that have their own panels and discussions, but I like to think that we're the best in terms of quality of content, maybe not in terms of graphics. So thanks. Oh, and be sure to smash like and subscribe and all that stuff.
All right, I'll see everybody. Thanks.